The smell of charcoal and mesquite smoke filled the humid Austin air as I pulled into my parents' driveway in Cedar Park, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Through the windshield, I could already see the familiar chaos of a Rodriguez family barbecue. Coolers scattered across the lawn, folding tables groaning under the weight of potato salad and corn on the cob, and my dad Robert manning his prized offset smoker like it was mission control. What I couldn't see yet, but knew was coming, was the moment when everything I'd worked for over the past 5 years would be dismissed with a wave of my mother's hand and a roll of her eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Emma Rodriguez, and at 28, I'd somehow become the family disappointment despite working 70-hour weeks and climbing the corporate ladder at one of Austin's most innovative tech companies. But today, sitting in my car outside, the house where I grew up, I felt exactly like I did at 15 when my sister Sophia brought home yet another academic award while I struggled with calculus. The difference was, this time I had something they didn't know about. Something that would change everything. The Rodriguez family barbecue was a sacred tradition that happened every first Saturday of June, rain or shine, for as long as I could. Remember, extended family would drive in from San Antonio, Houston, and even Dallas, turning our modest backyard into a sprawling celebration of perfectly seasoned brisket, mariachi music playing from somebody's Bluetooth speaker, and the kind of family gossip that could fuel conversations for months. As the middle child between my older brother Miguel, who'd become a successful lawyer in Dallas, and my younger sister Sophia, who'd just finished her residency and was about to start as a cardiologist, I'd learned to navigate these gatherings, with a smile plastered on my face and a speech prepared about how my job in digital marketing was going great. The truth was, my job was going more than great. It was going phenomenally. But in a family where success was measured by medical degrees, law degrees, and the ability to explain your career to Grandma Rosa in Spanish, working for a tech startup called Innovate First Solutions didn't carry much weight. Never mind that I'd been promoted 3 times in 4 years, or that my strategic campaigns had helped scale our client roster from 12 companies to over 200. Never mind that last month, our CEO Victoria Chen had pulled me aside after our quarterly meeting and said words that still made my heart race when I remembered them. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought from the passenger seat, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, and stepped out into the Texas heat. The familiar sounds of my family hit me immediately. My cousin Carlos arguing with Uncle David about the Spurs' chances next season. My Aunt Patricia's laugh carrying across the yard as she probably told the story about the time she accidentally dyed her hair green. And underneath it all, the steady stream of Spanish and English that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. "Emma! Mija! You made it!" My mother Linda appeared at my side seemingly out of nowhere, pulling me into one of her signature hugs that smelled like vanilla perfume and slightly burned onions. At 52, she still moved through family gatherings like a general commanding troops, making sure everyone had enough food, that the right people were talking to each other, and that no drama erupted before dessert was served. She took the wine from my hands without looking at the label, which was probably for the best since I'd splurged on a bottle that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "How's work, Mija? Still doing that computer thing?" The way she said computer thing made it sound like I spent my days playing solitaire instead of developing comprehensive digital strategies for Fortune 500 companies. I'd tried explaining my actual job countless times, how I analyzed market trends, created targeted campaigns, managed million-dollar budgets, and worked directly with C-suite executives. But it always seemed to go in one ear and out the other. "It's digital marketing, Mom, and yes, it's going really well. We just landed a huge new client and..." "That's nice, Mija. Your sister just got here with her boyfriend, Dr. Martinez. Did you know he's doing his fellowship at Houston Methodist? Such an accomplished young man." And just like that, the conversation shifted away from my life and toward Sophia's latest achievement. It was a dance we'd performed so many times I could have done it in my sleep. I made my way through the crowd, accepting hugs from relatives I saw once a year, and deflecting the usual questions about when I was going to settle down, buy a house, and give my parents grandchildren. My boyfriend Jake was supposed to be here, with me, but a last-minute emergency at his architectural firm had kept him in downtown Austin, leaving me to face the Rodriguez family inquisition alone. Not that Jake being here would have helped much. The last time I'd brought him to a family gathering, my dad had spent the entire evening asking him about his backup plan since architecture was such an unstable career. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family, who valued stability and traditional success above all else, consistently dismissed the one career path among us that was actually thriving in the modern economy. While they worried about Jake's chosen profession, his firm had just been featured in Architectural Digest for their innovative sustainable design work. While they questioned my commitment to a computer thing, I was on track to become the youngest director in my company's history. I found refuge by the drinks table, pouring myself a generous glass of sangria and watching the familiar dynamics play out across the yard. My brother Miguel was holding court by the pool, regaling a group of cousins with stories from his latest high-profile case. Sophia was showing off her engagement ring to a cluster of ants who were making all the appropriate cooing sounds. My dad was explaining his smoking technique to anyone who would listen, gesturing enthusiastically with his beer bottle. And there, I was, the middle child with the mysterious job that nobody quite understood or found impressive enough to ask detailed questions about. "Emma, there you are. Come here. I want you to meet someone." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sophia's voice cut through my moment of self-pity, and I turned to see her approaching with a tall, dark-haired man who had the kind of confident bearing that immediately screamed successful professional. This had to be the famous Dr. Martinez I'd been hearing about for the past 6 months. "Emma, this is Ricardo. Ricardo, this is my sister Emma. She works with computers." There it was again, that dismissive summary of my career that made it sound like I was tech support at a small office instead of a strategic marketing director at a rapidly growing company. Ricardo extended his hand with a polite smile, and I could see him doing the same mental calculation that everyone seemed to do when they met me, trying to figure out how the doctor and the lawyer had ended up with a sister who worked with computers. "Nice to meet you, Emma. Sophia tells me you're in IT?" His assumption was innocent enough, but it stung nonetheless. It was a perfectly respectable field, but it wasn't what I did, and the automatic assumption that any woman working in tech must be in a support role rather than a leadership position was exactly the kind of thinking I dealt with every day in my professional life. Actually, I'm in digital marketing strategy. I work for a tech company, but I focus on business development and client relations. I kept my voice pleasant, but I could feel the familiar frustration building in my chest. This conversation would last exactly 30 more seconds before Ricardo found an excuse to move on to someone whose job he could immediately categorize and respect. "Oh, that's nice. Social media stuff?" And there it was, 5 years of building marketing campaigns that had generated millions in revenue, reduced to social media stuff. I was about to launch into my standard explanation when my mother's voice rang out across the yard. "Everyone, dinner's ready. Come fill your plates." The conversation dissolved as Ricardo immediately turned toward the food tables, and I was left standing alone again, holding my sangria and wondering why I kept putting myself through these gatherings. The dinner line moved slowly, giving me plenty of time to listen to the conversations happening around me. My Aunt Patricia was bragging about her son's promotion to assistant manager at a car dealership. My cousin Maria was describing her daughter's acceptance to nursing school. Uncle David was explaining his plans to expand his plumbing business. Everyone had something concrete to share, something that could be easily understood and immediately respected. Meanwhile, I stood there with a job title that required a 5-minute explanation and accomplishments that sounded abstract to people who measured success in terms of patients saved or cases won. By the time I reached the front of the line, my dad had joined my mother behind the serving table, both of them beaming with pride as they watched their extended family enjoy the feast they'd prepared. Robert Rodriguez took barbecue seriously, in the way that some people take religion seriously, and the spread before us was truly impressive. Perfectly smoked brisket, fall-off-the-bone ribs, grilled corn with chili and lime, fresh pico de gallo, and enough sides to feed a small army. Emma, mija, make sure you try the new dry rub I used on the brisket. I've been perfecting it for months. My dad loaded my plate with enough meat to feed 3 people, the way he always did, as if extra barbecue could somehow make up for the lack of understanding that seemed to permeate every family interaction. I accepted the overflowing plate, gratefully, genuinely appreciating the effort he put into these gatherings, even if I dreaded the conversations that came with them. I found a spot at one of the folding tables next to my cousin Carlos and his wife Janet, both of whom worked for the city of Austin and had the kind of steady government jobs that my parents understood and approved of. Carlos was in his early 30s, just a few years older than me, and had always been one of the easier relatives to talk to. He at least pretended to be interested when I talked about work, even if I could see his eyes glaze over when I got into the technical details. So, Emma, how's the tech world treating you? Still conquering the internet? Carlos's joke was good-natured, but it carried the same underlying assumption that my work was somehow less serious or important than what everyone else was doing. I was about to respond when Janet jumped in with her own question. Have you thought about going back to school? I mean, tech is great and all, but don't you want something more stable? Something with benefits and a pension? It was a question. I'd heard variations of it every family gathering for the past 5 years, always delivered with genuine concern, but underlaid with the assumption that my current career was just a stepping stone to something more legitimate. The truth was, I had better benefits than most of my family members, a 401k that was growing faster than any pension, and job security that came from being genuinely good at something that companies desperately needed. But explaining that would require getting into details about stock options, performance bonuses, and market trends that would only reinforce their perception that my job was complicated and therefore suspicious. I'm really happy where I am, I said instead, cutting into my brisket and hoping the conversation would move on to safer topics. But Carlos wasn't done yet. That's great, Prima, but what exactly do you do all day? Like when you wake up Monday morning, what's your actual job? It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that always came up eventually at these gatherings. How do you explain digital marketing strategy to people who think social media is something teenagers do for fun? How do you describe the complexity of analyzing consumer behavior patterns, developing cross-platform campaigns, and managing client relationships worth millions of dollars? I took a deep breath and launched into my standard explanation, watching their faces as I talked about conversion rates and demographic targeting and brand positioning. I could see the exact moment when their attention started to drift, when their polite nods became automatic and their eyes began scanning the yard for more interesting conversations. It was the same every time, and it never got easier. So you make advertisements? Janet's summary was reductive, but not entirely wrong, and I found myself nodding even though it felt like describing a symphony as some people making noise with instruments. Among other things, yes. We develop comprehensive marketing strategies for companies looking to expand their digital presence. Even as I said it, I could hear how corporate and meaningless it sounded to people outside my industry. These were good people who worked hard and deserved respect for what they did, but the disconnect between their world and mine felt wider every year. The conversation was mercifully interrupted by the arrival of my grandmother Rosa, who at 78, still moved through family gatherings like a queen holding court. She settled into the chair next to me with a plate that contained exactly 3 small spoonfuls of food, claiming as always that she'd already eaten too much, but accepting bites from everyone else's plates anyway. "Mija, you look too skinny. Are you eating enough? And when are you going to bring that boy Jake around again?" I liked him. Grandma Rosa had always been my ally in the family, the one person who seemed to accept me exactly as I was without needing to understand every detail of my life. She switched effortlessly between English and Spanish, sometimes mid-sentence, and had a way of cutting through family drama with observations that were both wise and slightly subversive. "He wanted to be here, abuela, but he had to work. You know how it is." I squeezed her hand, grateful for her presence, even though I knew she had her own opinions about my life choices. Rosa Rodriguez had raised 6 children during an era when women had far fewer options. And while she supported my independence, I could tell she sometimes worried that I was prioritizing career over family in a way that might leave me lonely later in life. "Work on Saturday? What kind of work can't wait until Monday?" She asked the question with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, but it opened the door for my mother to rejoin the conversation from across the table. "That's what I keep telling her, Mama. These young people think work is everything. Emma spends all her time on that computer, staying late at the office, missing family dinners. And for what? It's not like she's saving lives like Sophia or helping people like Miguel." Linda's voice carried the particular tone she used when she was about to launch into one of her lectures about priorities and balance, the ones that always made me feel like a disappointing teenager, even though I was pushing 30. "Mom, I love what I do, and I'm good at it, really good at it." I tried to keep the defensiveness out of my voice, but it was a losing battle. These conversations had a way of reducing me to my 15-year-old self, the one who could never quite measure up to her siblings' achievements no matter how hard she tried. "I'm sure you are, Mija. But what's the point if it's not making you happy? You work all the time, you barely come to family events, and you're always stressed about something. Maybe it's time to think about a career change, something more stable, more fulfilling." The word fulfilling hung in the air like a challenge, as if my mother had determined that my job couldn't possibly be fulfilling simply because she didn't understand it. I felt my cheeks flush with frustration and embarrassment. Around us, conversations continued normally, but I could sense that our table had become the center of unwanted attention. Family members were pretending not to listen while obviously tuning in to see how this latest installment of Emma's career crisis would play out. It was a familiar script, one we'd performed countless times before, and I knew exactly how it would end, with me feeling defensive and misunderstood, and my mother feeling justified in her concern for my well-being. "My job is fulfilling, Mom. I help companies grow their businesses, I manage teams of creative professionals, and I'm actually really successful at what I do." Even as I said the words, I could hear how weak they sounded in the context of a family gathering where success was measured in lives saved and legal victories won. How do you compete with a sister who literally helps hearts keep beating? "But what's the future in it, Emma? Where does this lead? You can't do computer work forever." My father had joined the conversation now, his voice carrying the same concerned tone my mother had used, but with an edge of practical skepticism that I'd inherited and that drove me crazy when it was directed at me. Robert Rodriguez was a man who believed in concrete things: property ownership, steady paychecks, jobs that would exist in 20 years. The idea that someone could build a career in an industry that hadn't existed when he was my age was genuinely confusing to him. "Dad, technology isn't going anywhere. If anything, digital marketing is becoming more important every year. Companies need people who understand how to reach customers online, how to build brand awareness, how to—" I stopped myself before I launched into another explanation that would fall on deaf ears. This wasn't about facts or logic or the future of digital commerce. This was about their fundamental belief that my career was a phase I was going through before settling into something more serious. The conversation was interrupted by my cousin Marco's arrival at our table, fresh from the drink station and clearly several beers into his evening. Marco was Uncle David's eldest son, a construction foreman who'd always been the family clown, and his presence usually meant the conversation was about to take a lighter turn. But tonight, apparently, he'd been listening to our discussion from nearby and had opinions to share. "You know what Emma's problem is?" Marco announced to the table as he settled into an empty chair, sloshing beer slightly as he gestured with his bottle. "She's trying too hard to be something she's not. All this fancy corporate stuff, working for some company nobody's ever heard of, trying to impress people who don't care about family. What's wrong with getting a normal job like the rest of us?" The comment hit me like a physical blow, not because it was particularly insightful or cruel, but because it crystallized everything I'd been feeling for years. In Marco's worldview, and apparently in my family's worldview, ambition beyond their understanding was inherently suspect. Success that couldn't be easily categorized was somehow less legitimate than success that fit into familiar boxes. I was trying to be something I wasn't, rather than being successful at something they didn't recognize. "Marco, that's enough." Uncle David's voice carried a warning tone, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the humid Austin air, like smoke from my dad's barbecue pit, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention settling on me. This was the moment when I was supposed to defend myself, to explain once again what I did for a living and why it mattered. This was when I was supposed to smile and laugh off Marco's comment and redirect the conversation to safer ground. Instead, I set down my fork and looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life. These were people who loved me, I knew that. But they were also people who had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that my version of success didn't count. That my achievements were somehow less real because they happened in an industry they didn't understand. That my happiness and fulfillment were secondary to their comfort with familiar career paths. "You're right, Marco," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I am trying to be something. I'm trying to be successful on my own terms, doing work that challenges me and that I'm passionate about. I'm trying to build a career that will let me be financially independent and professionally fulfilled. And yes, I'm trying to prove that you don't have to follow a traditional path to create a meaningful life." The table had gone quiet now, even the conversations at nearby tables seeming to pause as if the entire barbecue could sense the shift in energy. My mother's face had taken on the expression she always wore when she thought I was being dramatic, a mixture of concern and exasperation that I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood and adolescence. "Emma, Mija, nobody's saying you're not successful. We just worry about you, that's all. You work so hard, and for what? Some company that could fire you tomorrow? Some job that keeps you glued to a computer screen instead of building real relationships?" Linda's voice had softened, but her words carried the same underlying message, that my choices were inherently flawed, that my priorities were misguided, that I was somehow failing at the basic task of building a satisfying life. I felt something inside me snap, not with anger, but with a kind of crystalline clarity that I'd never experienced before. For 5 years, I'd been coming to these gatherings and having versions of this same conversation. For 5 years, I'd been trying to translate my achievements into language my family could understand and respect. For 5 years, I'd been accepting their concern as love, while quietly resenting their inability to see me as I actually was, rather than as they thought I should be. "You want to know what I do? Really?" I stood up from the table, my voice carrying across the yard in a way that made nearby conversations stop entirely. "You want to know why I work late and why I'm passionate about my job and why I'm not worried about getting fired tomorrow." I could see my father starting to stand, probably planning to suggest we continue this conversation inside where it wouldn't become family entertainment. But I was beyond caring about who was listening. The frustration and hurt of years of dismissive comments and well-meaning concern had finally reached a breaking point, and I was done pretending that everything was fine. I don't just work for some random tech company. I don't just make advertisements or do computer stuff. I'm the director of strategic marketing for Innovate First Solutions, which means I develop and execute comprehensive marketing strategies for Fortune 500 companies. I manage a team of 12 people. I oversee campaigns with budgets larger than most people's annual salaries, and I'm directly responsible for generating millions of dollars in revenue every quarter. The words came out in a rush, 5 years of suppressed pride and frustration finally finding their voice. I could see surprise on some faces, skepticism on others, and something that might have been recognition in my grandmother's eyes. But I wasn't done yet. Last month, our CEO told me I was being considered for promotion to Vice President of Marketing, which would make me the youngest VP in the company's history. Next month, I'm leading a presentation to a potential client worth more than $50 million in contracted revenue. And in 6 months, if everything goes according to plan, I'll be making more money than anyone at this table, except maybe Miguel. The silence that followed my outburst was profound and uncomfortable. Broken only by the distant sound of children playing in the neighbor's yard and the soft hiss of meat still cooking on my father's grill. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my system as if I'd just finished running a marathon. I'd never spoken to my family like that before, had never demanded that they acknowledge my achievements or respect my choices. My mother was the first to break the silence, her voice carefully controlled in the way it got when she was trying not to escalate a situation that had already gotten out of hand. "Emma, we're proud of you. We've always been proud of you, but you don't have to prove anything to us." The comment was meant to be soothing, but it missed the point entirely. This wasn't about proving anything to them anymore. This was about finally refusing to accept their diminishment of my life and work. This was about demanding the same respect they automatically gave to my siblings' achievements. This was about standing up for the person I'd become, rather than apologizing for not being the person they thought I should be. "Don't I?" I asked, looking around the table at faces that seemed frozen in surprise and discomfort. Because for 5 years, I've been coming to these gatherings and listening to comments about my computer thing and my unstable career and my misplaced priorities. For 5 years, I've been watching you celebrate Miguel's cases and Sophia's medical achievements, while treating my job like it's some kind of hobby I'll grow out of eventually. Uncle David cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, but apparently feeling obligated to contribute something. "Emma, we don't mean to diminish what you do. It's just that we don't always understand it, you know? Your generation, with all this technology and these new kinds of jobs, it's different from what we're used to." His comment was meant to be conciliatory, but it highlighted exactly the problem I'd been struggling with for years. My success didn't count because it was unfamiliar. My achievements were somehow less legitimate because they happened in an industry that hadn't existed when my parents were building their careers. I was being judged not on my actual performance or happiness or financial stability, but on how well my choices matched their expectations of what a successful life should look like. "That's exactly the problem," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You don't have to understand every detail of what I do to respect that I'm good at it. You don't have to work in tech to acknowledge that I've built a successful career. You don't have to approve of my choices to support me the way you support Miguel and Sophia." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my Aunt Patricia, who had clearly been watching our table from across the yard and had decided to intervene before things escalated further. Patricia Rodriguez Martinez was my mother's younger sister, a nurse practitioner who had always served as the family diplomat during tense moments, and her timing was both perfect and terrible. "What's all this serious talk? This is supposed to be a party." Her voice was aggressively cheerful, the kind of forced lightness people use when they're trying to defuse a situation they don't fully understand. "Emma, mija, come help me set up the dessert table. Your mother made tres leches cake." It was a transparent attempt to redirect the conversation and give everyone a chance to reset, but I wasn't ready to let the moment pass. For once in my life, I wanted my family to sit with the discomfort of actually hearing how their comments affected me. I wanted them to consider the possibility that their concern was really judgment in disguise, and that their well-meaning advice was actually a rejection of who I'd chosen to become. Actually, Tia Patricia, I think we need to finish this conversation. I remained standing, acutely aware that my position above the table gave my words additional weight and authority. Because this isn't just about tonight, or about one comment from Marco, or about whether you understand my job. This is about the fact that I'm tired of feeling like I have to justify my life to people who should be celebrating it. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see my family members exchanging glances as they tried to figure out how to respond. This wasn't the Emma they were used to, the one who smiled and deflected and changed the subject when conversations became uncomfortable. This was someone who had finally reached her limit and decided that keeping the peace wasn't worth sacrificing her self-respect. My grandmother Rosa was the one who finally broke the tension, reaching up from her chair to take my hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft and warm, marked with the kind of age spots and small scars that told the story of decades of hard work and family dedication. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority that came from being the undisputed matriarch of the Rodriguez family. "Mija, sit down, please." It wasn't a request so much as a gentle command, and I found myself sinking back into my chair even though I wasn't finished saying everything I wanted to say. Rosa had a way of cutting through family drama with a combination of wisdom and pragmatism that made arguments seem suddenly petty and unimportant. "You know, when I was your age, there were no such things as computers. No internet, no cell phones, no marketing that wasn't putting an ad in the newspaper or on the radio." She paused, looking around the table at faces that were now focused entirely on her. But there were still people who thought they knew better than everyone else about how to live a good life. There were still families who couldn't understand when their children chose paths that were different from what they expected. Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and I suddenly remembered stories she'd told me years earlier about her own struggles with her parents when she'd chosen to marry my grandfather instead of the banker they'd picked out for her. Rosa Rodriguez had always been ahead of her time, working outside the home when most women of her generation stayed with their children, speaking her mind when others stayed quiet, building a life that reflected her values rather than other people's expectations. "Emma is successful," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Maybe we don't understand exactly what she does, but we can see that she works hard, that she's happy with her life, that she's building something meaningful. And maybe instead of worrying about whether her job fits our idea of what success should look like, we should be proud that we raised someone brave enough to create her own path." The simple statement hit me with unexpected emotional force, and I felt tears threatening for the first time since the conversation had started. This was what I'd been hoping to hear for years. Not necessarily understanding, but acknowledgement. Not approval of every choice I'd made, but respect for my right to make those choices. Not agreement with my priorities, but recognition that they were mine to set. My mother's voice was softer when she spoke again, some of the defensive edge gone from her tone. "We are proud of you, Emma. I hope you know that. It's just that we worry, you know. We see you working all the time, missing family events, and we wonder if you're really happy or if you're just telling yourself you're happy because you're successful." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and I could hear the genuine concern behind her words, even if I disagreed with her assessment of my life. Linda Rodriguez was a woman who had found deep satisfaction in raising her children and supporting her husband's career, and she genuinely couldn't understand how someone could find the same fulfillment in work that she'd found in family. It wasn't malicious, but it was limiting in ways that had taken me years to recognize and address. "I am happy, Mom. Really happy. I love the challenges of my job. I love the people I work with. And I love knowing that I'm building something meaningful with my skills and talents. It's different from the kind of happiness you found, but it's real. I reached across the table to squeeze her hand, wanting her to understand that my criticism wasn't a rejection of her choices or her love. The tension at our table was gradually dissolving as family members began to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. Conversations at nearby tables had resumed their normal volume and content, and I could sense that the crisis moment had passed. But something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of my family relationships, and I wasn't sure yet what the long-term implications would be. Marco, who had started the whole confrontation with his comment about me trying to be something I wasn't, cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time since my outburst. "Emma, I'm sorry about what I said. I was out of line and I didn't mean to upset you. I guess I just don't really understand what you do, but that doesn't mean it's not important." His apology was simple and genuine, and I felt some of the anger and hurt I'd been carrying finally beginning to release. Marco wasn't a bad person, just someone whose worldview was limited by his own experiences and who had never considered how his casual comments might affect the people around him. In many ways, he represented the broader challenge I faced with my family. People who meant well, but who struggled to expand their definition of success beyond what they personally understood and valued. Thank you, Marco. I appreciate that. I looked around the table at faces that seemed more open and attentive than they had been earlier in the evening. I don't need everyone to understand every detail of my job. I just need to feel like my choices are respected, like my achievements matter, like I'm seen as someone who's building a meaningful life rather than someone who's confused about what she wants. The conversation gradually shifted to safer topics, as family members seemed to recognize that we'd all reached our emotional limit for the evening. Uncle David started telling a story about a plumbing emergency he'd handled the previous week. Patricia began organizing the dessert service, and normal barbecue energy slowly returned to our corner of the yard. But I could feel that something important had happened, that a line had been drawn and boundaries had been established that hadn't existed before. As I helped clear plates and organize leftover food, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Victoria Chen just 3 weeks earlier, the one that my family still didn't know about, the one that would change everything about how they saw me and my career choices, the one that would prove, once and for all, that my unconventional path had led somewhere they could finally understand and respect. But that revelation would have to wait for another day, another conversation, another moment when I was ready to share the news that would reshape everything my family thought they knew about my life and my future. For tonight, it was enough that I'd finally found my voice and used it to demand the respect I deserved. The rest of the story would unfold in its own time. The drive home from the barbecue felt longer than usual, my hands still trembling slightly, as I navigated the familiar streets of Cedar Park back toward my apartment in South Austin. The conversation with my family replayed in my mind like a broken record, each word carrying more weight now that I'd finally said them out loud. I'd spent years imagining what it would feel like to stand up to their dismissive comments, but the reality was more exhausting and emotionally draining than I'd expected. My phone buzzed repeatedly on the passenger seat, probably family members texting about what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the messages yet. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for several minutes, watching the late evening light filter through the live oak trees that lined the parking lot. The familiar sounds of South Austin surrounded me, distant music from a nearby bar, the hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the Texas heat, the occasional laughter of neighbors gathering on their balconies. This was my world, the life I'd built for myself, and it felt like a sanctuary after the emotional battlefield of my family's backyard. My apartment was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a converted warehouse, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in plenty of natural light during the day. It wasn't fancy by most standards, but it was mine, furnished with pieces I'd carefully selected and decorated with artwork from local Austin artists. The living room walls were covered with framed certificates from marketing conferences, photos from company retreats, and a few pieces of original art that I'd commissioned from Jake's architect friends who dabbled in painting. It was the home of someone who took pride in her achievements and wasn't afraid to display them, even if her family didn't understand what they represented. I poured myself a generous glass of wine and settled onto my couch, finally ready to face the messages that had been accumulating on my phone throughout the evening. The first few were exactly what I'd expected: concerned texts from various family members asking if I was okay, whether I'd made it home safely, and suggesting that we all needed to have a calmer conversation soon. Uncle David had sent a particularly thoughtful message acknowledging that maybe the family hadn't been as supportive as they should have been, and promising to make more effort to understand what I did for work. But it was the message from my cousin Sophia that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Unlike the others, hers wasn't concerned or apologetic. Instead, it was sharp and defensive, carrying all the entitled frustration of someone who'd never had to fight for recognition or respect within our family structure. "Emma, I can't believe you made such a scene tonight. Mom called me crying after you left, saying you accused the whole family of not supporting you. Do you have any idea how dramatic you sounded? We've always been proud of you, but you can't expect everyone to understand your job when you can barely explain it yourself. Some of us are trying to build real careers that actually help people, not just make money for some corporation. Maybe if you focused less on impressing strangers and more on being present for your family, you wouldn't feel so misunderstood." The message hit me like a physical blow, not because it was particularly cruel or insightful, but because it crystallized everything that was wrong with my family's understanding of success and value. Sophia had never had to justify her career choices because being a doctor was automatically respected and understood. She'd never had to explain why her work mattered, because saving lives was obviously important. She'd never had to fight for recognition because her achievements fit perfectly into the categories that our family valued and celebrated. But more than that, her message revealed the fundamental assumption that had been driving our family's treatment of me for years: the belief that my career was somehow less worthy because it was driven by profit rather than service, because it involved working with corporations rather than individuals, because it required skills they couldn't easily categorize or understand. The implication that I was selfish for wanting recognition, that I was choosing strangers over family, that my success was somehow morally inferior to theirs, stung in ways I hadn't expected. I set my phone aside without responding, knowing that anything I wrote in my current emotional state would only escalate the conflict. Instead, I opened my laptop and did what I always did when I needed to process complicated feelings. I threw myself into work. There were emails to answer, campaign reports to review, and presentation slides to refine for Monday's client meeting. The familiar rhythm of professional tasks helped calm my racing thoughts and reminded me of why I'd chosen this career in the first place. The client meeting I was preparing for was with Henderson Global, a multinational logistics company that was considering a complete overhaul of their digital marketing strategy. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, complex project that I thrived on, requiring months of research, strategic planning, and creative problem-solving. If we landed the contract, it would be the largest single client in our company's history, worth over $30 million in projected revenue over 3 years. More importantly for me personally, successfully closing this deal would virtually guarantee my promotion to vice president and establish me as one of the youngest executives in Austin's tech scene. As I worked through the presentation slides, refining arguments and double-checking statistics, I found myself thinking about the conversation with Victoria Chen that had started this whole process. 3 weeks earlier, she'd called me into her office for what I'd assumed was a routine quarterly review. Instead, she'd offered me the opportunity to lead the Henderson Global pitch, explaining that the company's board of directors had specifically requested that I be the primary point of contact for their account. "Emma, I'm going to be direct. With you," Victoria had said, leaning back in her chair with the kind of confident ease that had made her one of the most respected CEOs in Austin's business community. "Henderson Global isn't just any client. They're the kind of account that can transform a company like ours from a regional player into a national contender. They've worked with some of the biggest marketing firms in the country, and they're not easily impressed. The fact that they want to work specifically with you says something significant about your reputation in this industry. At the time, I'd been flattered but focused on the practical challenges of managing such a large and complex account. It wasn't until later, after the initial meetings and strategy sessions had begun, that I'd started to understand the full implications of what Victoria was offering me. This wasn't just a big client or a career-defining project. This was my chance to prove once and for all that my unconventional path had led somewhere extraordinary. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family questioned the stability and legitimacy of my career, I was on the verge of achieving something that most marketing professionals could only dream of. While they worried about my future prospects and suggested I consider more traditional paths, I was being trusted with the kind of responsibility typically reserved for executives with decades more experience. While they dismissed my work as computer stuff and social media, I was developing strategies that would impact how a Fortune 500 company reached millions of customers worldwide. My phone buzzed again, interrupting my workflow, and I glanced at the screen to see Jake's name. Unlike the family messages I'd been avoiding, his was exactly what I needed to see. "Hey beautiful, just finished up at the office. Heard from your mom that there was some family drama tonight. Want to talk about it? I can bring takeout from that Thai place you like and we can decompress together. Love you." Jake Thompson had been in my life for 2 years, and in that time he'd become not just my romantic partner, but my closest confidant and most reliable source of emotional support. As an architect, he understood the challenges of working in a creative field that required both technical expertise and artistic vision. He'd experienced his own version of family skepticism about career choices that seemed risky or unconventional to older generations. More importantly, he'd always taken my professional achievements seriously, celebrating my successes and supporting me through the inevitable setbacks that came with any ambitious career. I texted him back immediately, suddenly desperate for the kind of understanding and validation that I'd never quite gotten from my family. Within 20 minutes, he was at my door with bags of pad thai and green curry, along with the easy smile and warm presence that had first attracted me to him at a networking event downtown 2 years earlier. "So," he said, settling onto my couch with containers of food spread between us, "your mom called me after you left. She seemed pretty shaken up by whatever happened at dinner. Want to tell me your version before I form any opinions based on the Rodriguez family drama filter?" I found myself laughing for the first time since leaving the barbecue, grateful for Jake's ability to inject humor into emotional situations without minimizing their importance. Over dinner, I walked him through the entire evening, from Marco's dismissive comment to my eventual confrontation with the whole table. Jake listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just giving me the space to process what had happened. "You know what strikes me about this whole situation?" he said when I'd finished recounting the evening's events. "It's not really about your job at all. It's about respect and recognition and feeling valued for who you are, rather than who they think you should be. Your family has created this narrative about what success looks like, and anything that doesn't fit that narrative gets dismissed or diminished, regardless of how objectively successful it actually is." His observation was perceptive and helpful, cutting through the emotional complexity of family dynamics to identify the core issue. But it also highlighted something that had been bothering me throughout the evening, the sense that my family's skepticism about my career was rooted in deeper assumptions about gender, ambition, and the appropriate boundaries of a woman's professional life. "I keep thinking about how different this would be if I were Miguel," I said, curling up against Jake's side as we finished our dinner. If he'd told the family he was being considered for partner at his law firm, or if he'd landed a huge corporate client, they'd be planning a celebration dinner and calling all the relatives to brag about his achievement. But when I talk about my success, It somehow becomes a concern about my priorities or my happiness, or whether I'm neglecting my personal life. Jake was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around my shoulders as he considered my words. As someone who'd grown up in a more liberal family environment, he sometimes struggled to understand the subtle ways that traditional gender expectations still influenced seemingly progressive families like mine. But he'd observed enough of my family interactions over the past 2 years to recognize the patterns I was describing. That's probably part of it, he agreed. But I also think there's something generational happening here. Your parents built their lives around very different economic realities and career expectations. The idea that someone could build wealth and stability through digital marketing probably seems as foreign to them as space travel. It doesn't make their skepticism right, but it might make it more understandable. His attempt to provide perspective was well-intentioned, but it missed something crucial that I'd been struggling to articulate all evening. This wasn't just about generational differences or unfamiliarity with new industries. This was about a fundamental refusal to extend the same trust and respect to my judgment that they automatically gave to my siblings. This was about assumptions that my success was somehow suspect or temporary or morally inferior to more traditional forms of achievement. Maybe, I said, not wanting to argue with Jake, but not entirely convinced by his analysis. But Miguel chose law school when he was 22, and they supported that decision without question, even though he'd never worked in a law firm or really understood what being a lawyer involved day to day. Sophia decided to become a doctor when she was 19, and they celebrated that choice immediately, even though she'd never worked in healthcare or had any real experience with patient care. But I've been successful in marketing for 5 years. I've been promoted multiple times. I've won industry awards. And they still talk about my career like it's an experiment I'm conducting until I figure out what I really want to do with my life. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing, the screen displaying my mother's name and photo. I stared at it for several seconds, debating whether I was emotionally ready for whatever conversation she wanted to have. Jake squeezed my hand encouragingly, and I finally answered on the 4th ring. "Hi, Mom." I tried to keep my voice neutral, not wanting to restart the evening's conflict, but not ready to pretend that everything was fine between us. "Misha, I've been thinking about tonight, about what you said at dinner." Linda's voice was softer than usual, carrying none of the defensive edge that had characterized our earlier conversation. "I talked to your father after everyone left, and we realized that maybe we haven't been as supportive as we thought we were being. We love you, Emma, and we're proud of what you've accomplished. But I think we've been so worried about your happiness that we forgot to celebrate your success." It was closer to an apology than I'd expected, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders beginning to release. But I also knew that this conversation would determine whether tonight's confrontation led to meaningful change in our relationship or just temporarily smoothed over the underlying issues without addressing them. "Mom, I appreciate that. I really do. But I need you to understand that questioning my career choices isn't the same as caring about my happiness. When you suggest that I should find something more stable or more fulfilling, what I hear is that you don't trust my judgment about my own life. When you dismiss my job as computer stuff, what I hear is that you don't think my work is important or valuable." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. When my mother spoke again, her voice was thoughtful and measured. "You're right, Miha. We haven't taken the time to really understand what you do or why it matters to you. We've been judging your choices based on our own experiences and expectations, and that wasn't fair. Your father and I want to do better. We want to learn about your work and support you the way we should have been supporting you all along." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering territory that felt both familiar and entirely new. For the first time in years, my mother asked specific questions about my job responsibilities, my career goals, and the projects I was most excited about. She listened without interrupting when I explained the Henderson Global opportunity and what it could mean for my future. She even asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of working in a male-dominated industry and whether I felt supported by my colleagues and supervisors. By the time we hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. It wasn't a complete transformation, and I knew there would probably be setbacks and misunderstandings along the way. But for the first time in years, I felt like my mother was genuinely trying to see me as I actually was, rather than as she thought I should be. Jake had been quietly cleaning up our dinner containers while I talked to my mother, giving me space for the conversation while staying close enough to provide support if I needed it. When I finally set down my phone, he wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice gentle and patient in the way that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. "Hopeful," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of my answer. "Exhausted and emotionally drained, but hopeful." I think tonight was the first time I really stood up for myself with my family, and while it was harder than I expected, it also felt necessary, like something that needed to happen before we could move forward. We spent the rest of the evening talking about family dynamics, career challenges, and the complicated process of establishing adult relationships with parents who still saw you as the child you used to be. Jake shared stories from his own experience of convincing his family that architecture was a viable career path, and I found comfort in knowing that even families who ultimately became supportive often went through periods of skepticism and concern. As we prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the Henderson Global presentation that was scheduled for the following Thursday. In less than a week, I would be standing in a conference room with some of the most senior executives in the logistics industry, presenting a marketing strategy that could transform both their company and mine. It was the kind of opportunity that I'd been working toward for years, the culmination of countless late nights, strategic decisions, and professional relationships that I'd carefully cultivated. More importantly, it was proof that my unconventional path had led somewhere extraordinary, regardless of whether my family understood or approved of the journey. The thought of calling my parents after landing the Henderson Global contract, of explaining what the deal meant in terms they could understand and appreciate, filled me with a mixture of anticipation and vindication that I hadn't expected. But that conversation was still a week away, and there was work to be done before I could even think about celebrating. The presentation needed to be perfect, the strategy needed to be flawless, and I needed to be prepared for every possible question or objection that the Henderson Global team might raise. It was the kind of high-pressure situation that had always brought out my best work, and I was determined to prove that their confidence in me had been well placed. The next morning arrived gray and humid, typical weather for Austin in early June, and I woke up feeling more focused and determined than I had in months. The emotional confrontation with my family had been draining, but it had also cleared the air in ways that felt liberating and empowering. I no longer had to pretend that their skepticism didn't bother me, and they could no longer pretend that their concerns were purely about my well-being, rather than their own comfort with unfamiliar career paths. I arrived at the Innovate First Solutions office early, eager to dive into the final preparations for the Henderson Global presentation. Our office occupied the top 2 floors of a converted warehouse in East Austin, with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that provided stunning views of the downtown skyline. It was the kind of workspace that attracted creative professionals and tech entrepreneurs, buzzing with the energy of people who were passionate about their work and ambitious about their futures. Victoria Chen was already in her office when I arrived, reviewing quarterly reports with the focused intensity that had made her one of the most respected executives in Austin's business community. At 42, she'd built Innovate First from a small startup into a regional powerhouse, and her reputation for strategic thinking and client management had attracted top talent from across the country. She'd been my mentor and advocate for the past 3 years, and her confidence in my abilities had been instrumental in my rapid advancement within the company. "Emma, perfect timing," she said, looking up from her computer as I knocked on her open door. "I just got off a call with Henderson, Global's board of directors. They're moving up the timeline for final presentations. Instead of next Thursday, they want to see us this Wednesday. That gives us 4 days to make sure everything is absolutely perfect." The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, but it was the good kind of pressure that I'd learned to thrive on in high-stakes situations. 4 days was tight, but it was manageable if I stayed focused and organized my time efficiently. More importantly, the accelerated timeline meant that I'd know the outcome of our pitch by the end of the week, which would either confirm my promotion to vice president or send me back to the drawing board to figure out my next career move. "What prompted the change?" I asked, settling into the chair across from Victoria's desk and pulling out my notebook to capture any additional details or requirements that might affect our presentation strategy. Apparently, their current marketing firm submitted a proposal that was significantly below expectations, and they're concerned about losing momentum on a campaign that's supposed to launch in September. They want to make a decision quickly so they can begin implementation by the end of the month. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. "The good news is that this puts us in a stronger position relative to our competition. The bad news is that they're going to be under tremendous pressure to choose a firm that can deliver results immediately." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of our presentation, from the opening slides that outlined our understanding of Henderson Global's market position to the detailed implementation timeline that showed how we would execute our recommended strategy. Victoria had an eye for detail that bordered on perfectionism, and she pushed me to refine arguments, strengthen evidence, and anticipate objections that I might not have considered on my own. By midday, I felt confident that our presentation was as strong as it could possibly be given the time constraints and available information. But I also knew that success would depend on more than just the quality of our strategic recommendations. Henderson Global was evaluating not just our ideas, but our team's ability to execute those ideas under pressure and deliver measurable results within tight deadlines. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Victoria said as we wrapped up our morning strategy session. "Henderson Global has specifically requested that you be the primary account manager if we win this contract. That means you'll be responsible for all client communications, project management, and strategic oversight for the duration of our relationship with them." The announcement was both thrilling and terrifying, representing exactly the kind of responsibility and recognition that I'd been working toward for years. Being chosen as the primary account manager for a client of Henderson Global's size and prominence would establish me as one of the leading marketing strategists in Austin's business community. It would also put tremendous pressure on me to deliver results that justified their confidence and validated Victoria's decision to promote me to vice president. They asked for me specifically? I wanted to make sure I understood the full implications of what Victoria was telling me. Client requests for specific team members were relatively rare in our industry, usually indicating either exceptional past performance or strong personal relationships that had been developed over time. They did. Apparently, word has gotten around about the work you did with Meridian Technologies and Blue Sky Innovations. Henderson Global's CMO specifically mentioned your reputation for developing data-driven strategies that deliver measurable ROI. Victoria smiled with the kind of pride that mentors show when their protégés achieve recognition beyond their immediate sphere of influence. The mention of my previous clients brought back memories of campaigns that had required months of intensive research, creative problem-solving, and strategic thinking. Meridian Technologies had been a mid-sized software company looking to expand into new markets, and the campaign I'd developed for them had resulted in a 40% increase in qualified leads within 6 months. Blue Sky Innovations had been struggling with brand recognition in a crowded marketplace, and our collaborative strategy had helped them achieve regional market leadership within 18 months. Both projects had been challenging and rewarding, requiring me to develop expertise in industries I'd known little about initially, and to build relationships with executives who had decades more experience than I did. But they'd also been relatively small-scale compared to what Henderson Global represented. This would be my first opportunity to apply my strategic approach to a truly large-scale, multinational client with complex operational requirements and significant budget constraints. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation, refinement, and nervous energy. I worked late each night, reviewing market research, rehearsing presentation segments, and anticipating every possible question or objection that the Henderson Global team might raise. Jake brought me dinner at the office twice, understanding that this opportunity required the kind of focused intensity that temporarily consumed all other priorities and commitments. My family situation remained in the icy background of my consciousness, present but not dominant as I focused on the immediate challenge ahead of me. My mother had called twice during the week, asking about my schedule and whether I wanted to come to dinner on Sunday. The conversations were pleasant and supportive, lacking the underlying tension that had characterized our interactions for years. It felt like a promising sign that our confrontation at the barbecue had opened the door to a more honest and respectful relationship. Wednesday morning arrived clear and hot, the kind of blazing Austin summer day that reminded everyone why air conditioning had been such a revolutionary invention. I dressed carefully in my best business suit, choosing jewelry and accessories that projected confidence and professionalism without being flashy or distracting. The Henderson Global presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving me the morning to review my notes one final time and mentally prepare for what could be the most important 2 hours of my professional career. Victoria and I arrived at Henderson Global's downtown office building 30 minutes early, using the extra time to familiarize ourselves with the conference room layout and test our presentation technology. The building was impressive even by Austin standards, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that commanded spectacular views of Lady Bird Lake and the surrounding hill country. The Henderson Global offices occupied the top 3 floors, with executive conference rooms that featured floor-to-ceiling windows and furnishings that spoke of both success and sophistication. As we set up our materials and reviewed our talking points one final time, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I'd been a recent college graduate with a marketing degree and ambitious dreams but no clear idea of how to achieve them. I'd taken an entry-level position with a small agency, worked nights and weekends to develop my skills, and gradually built a reputation for strategic thinking and creative problem-solving that had opened doors to increasingly challenging opportunities. Along the way, I'd faced skepticism from family members who didn't understand my career path, colleagues who questioned whether someone my age could handle senior-level responsibilities, and clients who initially doubted my expertise and experience. But I'd also found mentors like Victoria who believed in my potential, colleagues who respected my work ethic and strategic insights, and clients who appreciated my fresh perspective and data-driven approach to marketing challenges. The Henderson Global team began filing into the conference room at exactly 2 o'clock, and I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that always accompanied high-stakes presentations. There were 8 people in total, including the chief marketing officer, the director of business development, and several senior managers who would be involved in implementing whatever strategy they ultimately chose. They were professionally dressed and serious-minded, the kind of executives who had built their careers on making smart decisions and delivering measurable results. Victoria handled the introductions and opening remarks, establishing the context for our presentation and outlining the agenda for the next 90 minutes. Then it was my turn to take center stage, to present the strategic recommendations that we'd been developing for the past 6 weeks, and to demonstrate why Innovate First Solutions was the right partner to help Henderson Global achieve their ambitious growth objectives. Standing at the front of the Henderson Global conference room, I felt every eye in the room focused on me with the kind of intensity that could either elevate or destroy a career in the span of 90 minutes. The Chief Marketing Officer, Patricia Williams, was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the sort of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd heard every marketing pitch imaginable and wasn't easily impressed. Beside her sat Director of Business Development Marcus Chen, whose reputation for asking pointed questions had made him legendary among Austin's marketing community. I began with our analysis of Henderson Global's current market position, walking through slides that demonstrated both their strengths and the opportunities they were missing in an increasingly digital marketplace. The research had taken weeks to compile, involving deep dives into their competitors' strategies, consumer behavior patterns in their target demographics, and emerging trends in logistics and supply chain management. Every statistic had been verified, every recommendation backed by concrete data, and every projection based on conservative assumptions that accounted for market volatility and implementation challenges. Currently, Henderson Global captures approximately 12% of online engagement within your primary market segment, I explained, clicking to a slide that showed detailed analytics from their existing digital presence. However, our research indicates that 73% of your target demographic begins their vendor selection process with online research, which means you're missing critical opportunities to influence purchasing decisions at the most crucial stage of the customer journey. Patricia Williams leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from polite attention to genuine interest. Walk me through how you arrived at that 73% figure. What's your methodology, and how confident are you in the accuracy of that data? It was exactly the kind of detailed, skeptical question I'd been preparing for, and I felt a surge of confidence as I launched into an explanation of our research process. We'd conducted surveys with over 2,000 logistics managers across multiple industries, analyzed purchasing patterns from public records and industry reports, and cross-referenced our findings with data from 3 independent market research firms. The 73% figure wasn't just accurate, it was conservative compared to what some of our sources had suggested. As I continued through the presentation, I could sense the room's energy shifting from polite professionalism to engaged curiosity. Marcus Chen began taking detailed notes, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was thinking seriously about implementation timelines and budget allocations. The senior managers started exchanging glances that suggested they were seeing possibilities they hadn't considered before our meeting. The strategy I was proposing wasn't revolutionary, but it was comprehensive and sophisticated in ways that would set Henderson Global apart from their competitors. We were recommending an integrated approach that combined targeted digital advertising, content marketing, strategic partnerships, and data analytics to create a customer acquisition system that could scale with their growth objectives. More importantly, we were offering to implement the entire strategy with measurable milestones and guaranteed performance metrics that would protect their investment while ensuring accountability on our end. The projected ROI for year 1 is conservative at 18%, I explained, advancing to a slide that showed detailed financial projections broken down by quarter and by marketing channel. However, based on our experience with similar clients and the market research we've conducted, we believe the actual returns could be significantly higher, potentially reaching 25 to 30% if market conditions remain favorable and implementation proceeds according to our recommended timeline. Patricia Williams exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus Chen before asking the question I'd been both dreading and anticipating throughout the entire presentation. Emma, you've put together an impressive strategy, and your research is clearly thorough. But Henderson Global is a billion-dollar company with operations in 37 countries. How do we know that you and your team have the experience and infrastructure to execute a project of this scale and complexity? It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of the challenge facing any mid-size agency trying to compete for enterprise-level accounts. Innovate First Solutions had an excellent track record with regional and mid-market clients, but Henderson Global would be by far the largest and most complex account we'd ever managed. The honest answer was that we'd never handled anything quite like this before, but I was confident that our strategic approach and collaborative processes would translate effectively to a larger scale. You're absolutely right to ask that question, I replied, maintaining eye contact with Patricia while being mindful of the other executives around the table. Henderson Global would be our largest account, and I won't pretend otherwise. However, what we bring to this partnership isn't just experience with large budgets or complex organizational structures. What we bring is a level of strategic focus and personal attention that you're unlikely to get from the multinational agencies who see your account as one of dozens rather than as the centerpiece of their growth strategy. I advanced to a slide that outlined our proposed account management structure, showing how we would dedicate specific team members exclusively to Henderson Global's projects and establish direct communication channels that would ensure rapid response times and seamless coordination. The approach was designed to combine the strategic sophistication of a large agency with the agility and personalized service of a boutique firm. Furthermore, I continued, feeling increasingly confident as I saw heads nodding around the table, our analysis suggests that your previous marketing partners may have been treating Henderson Global as a logistics company that happens to need marketing support, rather than as a customer experience company that happens to operate in the logistics space. Our entire strategy is built around the understanding that your success depends not just on operational efficiency, but on building relationships and trust with clients who have multiple vendor options and increasingly sophisticated expectations. The distinction was subtle but important, reflecting a fundamental shift in how business-to-business marketing had evolved over the past decade. Companies like Henderson Global could no longer rely solely on competitive pricing and operational excellence to win and retain clients. They needed to build brand recognition, establish thought leadership, and create emotional connections that would influence purchasing decisions even when competitors offered similar services at comparable prices. Marcus Chen set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, a gesture that suggested he was moving from information-gathering mode to decision-making mode. Let's talk implementation timeline. If we were to move forward with your recommendations, how quickly could you begin execution? And what would the ramp-up period look like? This was the moment I'd been building toward throughout the entire presentation, the opportunity to demonstrate that we weren't just strategic thinkers, but practical implementers who understood the urgency of Henderson Global's situation. Their current marketing firm had failed to deliver results. Their competitors were gaining market share, and they needed a partner who could begin generating momentum immediately, rather than spending months on additional research and planning. We can begin implementation within 2 weeks of contract signing, I said, advancing to a detailed project timeline that showed deliverables by week for the first 90 days. Our team has already begun preliminary work on campaign development and vendor selection, contingent on your approval. We've identified the key performance indicators that will measure success, established relationships with the technology platforms we'll need, and developed creative concepts that can be rapidly customized based on your final input and preferences. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, reflecting the kind of rapid deployment that had become Innovate First Solutions' signature strength. While larger agencies often required months of onboarding and bureaucratic processes, we could move from strategy to execution with the speed and flexibility that growing companies like Henderson Global needed to stay competitive in rapidly evolving markets. Patricia Williams studied the timeline carefully before asking her final question, the one that would determine whether the past 6 weeks of preparation had been worth the investment of time and energy. What makes you confident that this strategy will work? Not hopeful, not optimistic, but confident enough to stake your professional reputation on the results? The question required both honesty and conviction, acknowledging the inherent risks of any marketing strategy while demonstrating the research-based confidence that separated professional recommendations from wishful thinking. I took a deep breath, thinking about all the late nights, client meetings, and strategic decisions that had led to this moment. Because we've tested core elements of this strategy with 3 similar companies over the past 18 months, and in each case, we've achieved or exceeded projected results within the first year, I replied, Because our research methodology is rigorous enough that we're comfortable guaranteeing specific performance metrics, with financial penalties if we fail to deliver. And because Henderson Global has market advantages and operational strengths that create ideal conditions for the kind of strategic marketing we're proposing. I clicked to a final slide that showed case studies from our work with Meridian Technologies and Blue Sky Innovations, demonstrating measurable results that validated our approach and methodology. The examples weren't perfect analogies to Henderson Global's situation, but they showed consistent patterns of success that suggested our strategies were transferable across different industries and market conditions. Most importantly, I concluded, we're confident because we're proposing to implement exactly the kind of integrated, data-driven marketing strategy that we would want if we were in your position. This isn't a generic approach that we pitch to every potential client. This is a customized strategy built specifically around Henderson Global's market position, competitive challenges, and growth objectives. The presentation concluded with questions that continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from budget allocation details to crisis management protocols. The Henderson Global team was thorough and professional, asking the kind of detailed questions that suggested they were seriously considering our proposal, rather than simply going through the motions of a competitive bidding process. When the Yasabuai meeting finally ended, Patricia Williams shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested genuine respect rather than polite formality. Emma, this has been one of the most comprehensive and thoughtful presentations we've seen. We'll be making our decision by Friday, and you should expect to hear from us early next week regardless of the outcome. Victoria and I gathered our materials and made our way back to the parking garage, both of us maintaining professional composure until we were safely inside her car and away from any potential Henderson Global employees who might overhear our conversation. Only then did we allow ourselves to acknowledge what had just happened. That went better than I'd hoped, Victoria said, starting the engine and pulling out of the downtown garage into the late afternoon Austin traffic. Did you see Patricia Williams taking notes during your ROI explanation? And Marcus Chen asking about implementation timelines? Those aren't the kinds of questions people ask unless they're seriously considering moving forward. I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the emotional aftermath of performing at peak level under intense pressure. The presentation had gone well, better than well, but I'd learned not to get too optimistic about outcomes until contracts were actually signed. Too many factors beyond our control could influence the final decision, from budget constraints to internal politics, to competitor proposals that we knew nothing about. But I also couldn't deny the sense of professional satisfaction that came from knowing I'd presented a strategy I was genuinely proud of, backed by research I was confident in, to executives who had taken our recommendations seriously. Regardless of Henderson Global's final decision, the presentation had been a validation of the career path I'd chosen and the skills I'd developed over the past 5 years. The drive back to our office gave me time to decompress and process what had just happened. For 90 minutes, I'd been the primary spokesperson for a marketing strategy that could generate millions of dollars in revenue and establish new industry standards for logistics companies. I'd fielded detailed questions from executives with decades of experience, defended research methodologies under intensive scrutiny, and presented financial projections that would impact hundreds of employees across multiple countries. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, complex professional challenge that I'd been working toward since college, and I'd handled it with the confidence and expertise that came from years of preparation and experience. More importantly, I'd done it while representing not just my own interests, but the interests of everyone at Innovate First Solutions who had contributed to developing our strategic recommendations. Thursday and Friday passed slowly, filled with routine client work that felt mundane compared to the intensity of the Henderson Global presentation. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, hoping for any communication that might provide hints about their decision-making process. Victoria reminded me repeatedly that enterprise-level decisions typically required extensive internal discussions and approval processes, but the waiting was still nerve-wracking. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected call from my mother, asking if Jake and I wanted to join the family for dinner on Sunday. The invitation was casual and friendly, lacking the underlying tension that had characterized our interactions for years. Since our conversation after the barbecue confrontation, my parents had made genuine efforts to show interest in my career and to avoid the dismissive comments that had triggered our conflict. "I'd love to come," I told her, meaning it for the first time in months. "But I should warn you that I might get some work calls. We're waiting to hear about a big project, and I might need to step away if my boss needs to discuss something urgent." "Of course, mija. We understand. Your father and I have been reading about digital marketing online, trying to learn more about what you do. We found some articles about how important it is for companies to have strong online presence. We're proud of you for being part of something so significant." The comment was simple and straightforward, but it represented a fundamental shift in how my parents viewed my career. For the first time, they were making an effort to understand my work on its own terms, rather than judging it against their preconceived notions of what constituted legitimate professional success. It wasn't complete transformation, but it was genuine progress that gave me hope for our future relationship. Sunday dinner at my parents' house felt different from family gatherings in recent memory. The conversation was more relaxed, the questions about my work more informed and respectful, and the overall atmosphere more accepting of different career paths and life choices. My father asked thoughtful questions about digital marketing trends. My mother wanted to understand how I measured the success of marketing campaigns. And even my siblings seemed more interested in my professional experiences than they'd been in years. We were halfway through dessert when my phone rang, displaying Victoria's name and photo. I glanced around the table apologetically before answering, my heart rate immediately accelerating as I considered the possible reasons for her Sunday evening call. "Emma, I just got a call from Patricia Williams. Henderson Global has made their decision." Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, providing no hints about whether the news was positive or negative. "Can you be in the office in an hour? We need to discuss the next steps." I agreed immediately, gathering my things and explaining to my family that I needed to leave for an urgent work meeting. The drive from Cedar Park to downtown Austin felt longer than usual, my mind racing through every possible scenario and outcome. Victoria's tone had been neutral, which could mean anything from celebration to consolation, and I tried to prepare myself emotionally for either possibility. The Innovate First Solutions office was empty except for Victoria, who was waiting in the conference room with a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket and a stack of contracts spread across the table. The sight of the champagne answered my question before she could say a word, and I felt my knees go weak with relief and excitement. "We got it," Victoria said, standing up with a smile that was both professional and genuinely jubilant. "Henderson Global has selected us as their primary marketing partner, with a 3-year contract worth $32 million. Patricia Williams specifically mentioned your presentation as the deciding factor. Congratulations, Emma. You've just landed the biggest client in our company's history." The news was overwhelming in the best possible way, representing not just professional success, but validation of every choice I'd made over the past 5 years. The Henderson Global contract would establish Innovate First Solutions as a major player in Austin's marketing community, create opportunities for expansion and growth that would benefit every employee, and position me as one of the youngest senior executives in the city's business ecosystem. "There's one more thing," Victoria continued, pouring champagne into 2 glasses and handing one to me. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to Vice President of Strategic Accounts, with primary responsibility for the Henderson Global relationship and any similar enterprise-level clients we acquire. Your salary is increasing by 40%. You'll receive equity participation in the company, and you'll have budget authority for hiring additional team members as needed to support your accounts. The promotion was everything I'd been working toward and more, representing recognition not just of my performance on the Henderson Global project, but of my potential to help lead the company through its next phase of growth. At 28, I would be one of the youngest VPs in Austin's marketing industry, with responsibility for managing relationships worth tens of millions of dollars and team leadership authority that would shape the careers of other ambitious professionals. We spent the next hour discussing implementation timelines, team assignments, and strategic priorities for the Henderson Global relationship. The contract included performance bonuses that could significantly increase my compensation if we exceeded our projected results, along with professional development opportunities that would prepare me for even greater responsibilities in the future. As I drove home through the quiet Sunday evening streets of Austin, I found myself thinking about the family barbecue that had happened just 2 weeks earlier. The Emma Rodriguez who had stood up to her family's dismissive comments about her computer thing career was the same person who had just been promoted to vice president based on landing the largest client in her company's history. The professional success had been building for years, but the personal confidence to demand respect and recognition had been more recent development. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake asking how the meeting had gone, and I realized I hadn't told anyone except Victoria about the Henderson Global outcome yet. Tomorrow, I would share the news with my family, my friends, and my colleagues, but tonight, I wanted to savor the moment of personal achievement and professional validation. The promotion would change many things about my daily work life and career trajectory, but it would also provide concrete evidence for anyone who questioned the legitimacy or stability of my chosen profession. I was no longer someone with an interesting but mysterious job in the tech industry. I was a vice president with a Fortune 500 client, a substantial salary, and leadership responsibilities that would be easily understood and respected by anyone, regardless of their familiarity with digital marketing. More importantly, I had proven to myself that standing up for my principles and demanding respect for my achievements had been the right choice, even when it felt uncomfortable and risky. The confrontation with my family hadn't just cleared the air. It had forced me to articulate my own sense of professional worth in ways that had carried over into my presentation with Henderson Global. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I made a mental note to call my parents first thing Monday morning, not to gloat or prove a point, but to share genuinely exciting news with people who I hoped would finally understand why I'd been so passionate about a career they'd never quite been able to appreciate. The conversation would mark a new chapter in both my professional life and my family relationships, built on mutual respect rather than patient tolerance. Monday morning brought the kind of brilliant Austin sunshine that made even the most mundane tasks feel charged with possibility. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, still processing the magnitude of what had happened, and eager to begin the work of transforming a theoretical strategy into operational reality. The Henderson Global contract represented more than just professional success. It was validation of everything I'd believed about my own capabilities and potential. Victoria had scheduled an all-hands meeting for 9 o'clock to announce the new client and my promotion to the entire team. Innovate First Solutions employed 43 people across multiple departments, from creative designers to data analysts to account coordinators, and landing Henderson Global would create opportunities for advancement and professional development that would benefit everyone in the company. As employees filtered into our main conference room, I could sense the anticipation and curiosity that always accompanied major announcements. Some of my colleagues had worked on preliminary research for the Henderson Global pitch, but most of the team had no idea how significant the opportunity was or what the implications might be for their own careers and job security. We've been pursuing a major new client for the past 2 months, Victoria began, standing at the front of the room with the kind of confident energy that had made her such an effective leader. I'm pleased to announce that Henderson Global has selected Innovate First Solutions as their primary marketing partner, with a 3-year contract worth $32 million. The room erupted in applause and excited conversation, with colleagues exchanging high fives and congratulations. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why I loved working for a mid-sized company where everyone's contributions mattered, and major victories were shared achievements rather than distant corporate milestones. Additionally, Victoria continued, waiting for the celebration to quiet down. I'm promoting Emma Rodriguez to Vice President of Strategic Accounts, effective immediately. Emma will be leading the Henderson Global Relationship and overseeing our expansion into enterprise-level client services. The second round of applause was more sustained and enthusiastic, with several colleagues offering personal congratulations and expressions of genuine excitement about my promotion. These were people who had worked alongside me for years, who had contributed to my projects and benefited from my mentorship, and their support meant more to me than any external recognition could have provided. After the meeting, I spent the morning fielding congratulations from clients, industry contacts, and competitors who had heard about the Henderson Global deal through Austin's remarkably interconnected business community. By lunchtime, 3 different marketing publications had reached out for interviews about how a mid-size agency had successfully competed against multinational firms for such a significant contract. The attention was flattering, but also slightly overwhelming, forcing me to think carefully about how I wanted to present both my own achievements and innovate-first solutions capabilities to a broader professional audience. The marketing industry was highly competitive and often unforgiving, and I knew that our success with Henderson Global would make us targets for recruitment efforts, competitive attacks, and heightened scrutiny from peers and rivals. Around 2 o'clock, my phone rang with a call from my father, whose voice carried a mixture of pride and curiosity that I'd never heard before in our professional conversations. "Mija, your mother told me you had some important work news yesterday. She said you couldn't talk about it at dinner, but that you seemed excited about whatever was happening. Can you share it now, or is it still confidential?" The question gave me an opportunity I'd been anticipating since Sunday night. The chance to share genuinely significant professional news with family members who had finally learned to take my career seriously. But I also realized that explaining the magnitude of the Henderson Global deal would require providing context about my industry, my company, and the competitive landscape that they might not immediately understand. "Dad, I got promoted to vice president, and our company just landed the biggest client in our history. It's a Fortune 500 company called Henderson Global, and they hired us to handle all their marketing for the next 3 years. The contract is worth over $30 million, and I'm going to be the primary person managing the relationship." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear my father processing the numbers and trying to understand what they meant in terms of my career trajectory and professional standing. $30 million? His voice carried a note of amazement that made me smile. "Emma, that's more money than most small businesses make in their entire existence. You're personally responsible for managing a $30 million account?" "I am," I confirmed, feeling a surge of pride at being able to share concrete, impressive numbers that required no translation or explanation. "And if we do a good job with Henderson Global, it could lead to similar contracts with other large companies. Victoria thinks this could transform our agency from a regional firm into a national player." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with my father asking detailed questions about my new responsibilities, my salary increase, and what this meant for my long-term career prospects. For the first time in our relationship, he was engaging with my professional life as something significant and worthy of respect, rather than as a mysterious endeavor that he tolerated but didn't understand. "Your mother is going to be so proud when I tell her," he said before we hung up. "We both are, Mija. We're sorry it took us so long to understand how successful you've become. Maybe we can take you and Jake out to dinner this weekend to celebrate properly." The offer was simple but meaningful, representing the kind of family recognition and support that I'd been hoping for throughout my entire career. More importantly, It suggested that our confrontation at the barbecue had created space for genuine change in our relationships, rather than just temporary politeness, followed by a return to old patterns. Tuesday brought the first official meeting with the Henderson Global team as their newly selected marketing partner. Patricia Williams and Marcus Chen flew in from Houston for a full-day strategy session that would establish our working relationship and begin the process of transforming our presentation concepts into actionable campaign elements. The meeting took place at Henderson Global's Austin satellite office, a smaller but impressive facility that housed their regional operations and served as a coordination point for their Texas-based logistics networks. Walking into their conference room, as the lead strategist rather than a hopeful vendor felt surreal, marking a transition from pitching capabilities to delivering results. "Emma, congratulations on the promotion," Patricia Williams said as we settled around the conference table. "Marcus and I were impressed not just by your strategic recommendations, but by your poise and expertise during the presentation. We're looking forward to working with someone who clearly understands both the opportunities and challenges facing companies like ours." The compliment was professional and measured, but it carried weight coming from someone with Patricia's experience and reputation. Henderson Global hadn't built their success by making careless decisions about business partnerships, and their confidence in my abilities represented validation from executives who had worked with marketing professionals across multiple continents and industries. The day-long meeting covered everything from campaign timelines to budget allocations to performance metrics that would measure our success over the first 6 months of our partnership. We discussed creative concepts, target audience refinements, and technological requirements that would support the integrated marketing approach we'd recommended in our original presentation. By the end of the session, I had a detailed implementation plan that would keep me busy for the next 90 days and a clear understanding of Henderson Global's expectations for both immediate results and long-term strategic development. More importantly, I had established personal working relationships with key decision-makers who would be evaluating my performance and determining whether our partnership would extend beyond the initial 3-year commitment. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected call from Maya Patel, my best friend from college who now worked as a financial advisor in Dallas. Maya had always been one of my most supportive friends, someone who understood my professional ambitions and celebrated my achievements without reservation or qualification. "Emma Rodriguez, Vice President," she said when I answered the phone, her voice filled with the kind of genuine excitement that made me grateful for friendships that transcended geographical distance and career differences. I saw the announcement in Marketing Weekly magazine. $32 million? Are you kidding me? Do you realize you're now managing more money than some small countries have in their entire annual budgets? Maya's enthusiasm was infectious and validating, reminding me that my achievement was objectively impressive rather than just personally meaningful. Sometimes when you're deeply embedded in a particular industry or career path, it becomes difficult to maintain perspective about how your accomplishments appear to people outside your immediate professional circle. "It still doesn't feel completely real," I admitted, settling into my office chair and looking out at the Austin skyline through my window. 6 months ago, I was worried about whether my family would ever take my career seriously. Now, I'm responsible for one of the largest marketing accounts in Texas. 6 months ago, your family was worried you were wasting your talents on some fly-by-night tech job, Maya replied with characteristic directness. Now you're probably making more money than your doctor sister and your lawyer brother combined. Have you told them about the promotion yet? The question highlighted something I'd been thinking about since Monday's conversation with my father. While I'd shared the basic facts about my promotion and the Henderson Global contract, I hadn't really conveyed the full magnitude of what had happened or what it meant for my career trajectory and financial future. Part of me was still protecting myself against the possibility that they might find ways to diminish or qualify my success, even when it was objectively impressive by any reasonable standard. I told my dad about the promotion and the client, but I haven't really explained what it means in terms of salary or career advancement, I said. I guess I'm still getting used to the idea that they might actually be impressed rather than finding reasons to worry or offer unsolicited advice about my life choices. Maya laughed, but it was understanding rather than dismissive. Emma, you just landed a promotion that most marketing professionals dream about their entire careers. You're 28 years old, you're managing Fortune 500 clients, and you're probably in the top 5% of earners in your age group. If your family can't celebrate that, the problem is with them, not with your achievements. Her perspective was helpful and reassuring, providing the kind of external validation that sometimes made it easier to maintain confidence in situations where family dynamics created emotional complexity. Maya had known me throughout college and my early career, and she'd witnessed both my professional growth and my struggles with family recognition and support. Thursday brought another significant development when Victoria asked me to join her for lunch with the managing partners of 3 other Austin marketing agencies. The meeting was ostensibly social, a celebration of our Henderson global success, but I quickly realized it was also an opportunity for the local marketing community to evaluate Innovate First Solutions' new competitive position and to assess my capabilities as a newly promoted executive. The conversation ranged from industry trends to client development strategies to the challenges of scaling mid-size agencies in an increasingly competitive marketplace. I found myself holding my own in discussions with executives who had decades more experience than I did, contributing insights that were taken seriously and asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated both my strategic thinking and my understanding of broader market dynamics. Emma, you've accomplished something remarkable with Henderson Global, said Jennifer Walsh, the founding partner of Walsh Creative, one of Austin's most established marketing firms. Landing a Fortune 500 client is challenging enough, but doing it as the lead strategist at your age is genuinely impressive. How are you planning to leverage this success into additional enterprise-level opportunities? The question was both compliment and challenge, acknowledging my achievement while testing whether I had the strategic vision necessary to build sustainable success rather than just capitalizing on a single lucky break. It was the kind of inquiry that separated professionals who could execute specific projects from those who could develop long-term competitive advantages and industry leadership positions. Henderson Global is an incredible opportunity, but it's also a proof of concept for our approach to enterprise marketing, I replied, drawing on conversations I'd been having with Victoria about our company's growth strategy. We're not trying to become a traditional large agency that competes primarily on size and infrastructure. Instead, we're positioning ourselves as the strategic partner that combines sophisticated analysis with agile implementation, offering enterprise clients the attention and creativity they can't get from multinational firms. The response seemed to resonate with the group, generating follow-up questions about our staffing plans, our technology investments, and our approach to maintaining quality while scaling operations. By the end of lunch, I felt like I'd been accepted into Austin's senior marketing community as a peer rather than a promising junior executive who might someday achieve significant accomplishments. Friday afternoon brought the call I'd been both anticipating and dreading since Monday morning. My mother's voice was warm and excited when I answered, carrying none of the underlying concern or qualification that had characterized our career-related conversations for years. Mija, your father told me about your promotion and this new client. We're so proud of you, and we want to celebrate this weekend. Can you and Jake come to dinner Saturday night? We're inviting Uncle David and Aunt Patricia, and maybe Sophia and Ricardo if they're available. We want everyone to know how successful you've become. The invitation was everything I'd hoped for throughout my career, but it also made me nervous in ways I hadn't expected. For years, I'd wanted my family to recognize and celebrate my professional achievements. Now that recognition was being offered, I found myself worried about whether the celebration would be genuine or whether it would become another opportunity for comparison and competition with my siblings' accomplishments. Of course, Mom. Jake and I would love to come. but please don't make it a big deal or put pressure on anyone else to attend. I just want to have a nice family dinner and share some good news." "Emma, this is a big deal," my mother replied with conviction. "You're a vice president at 28 years old, managing millions of dollars for a Fortune 500 company. That's something worth celebrating, and we should have been celebrating your success all along instead of worrying about whether you were making the right choices." The acknowledgement was more direct and comprehensive than anything I'd heard from my family before, representing not just recognition of my current achievement, but an admission that their previous skepticism had been misguided. It was the kind of statement that could mark a genuine turning point in our relationship if it was backed up by consistent changes in behavior and attitude. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect Austin weather that made outdoor gatherings feel magical. My parents had prepared a feast that rivaled their traditional barbecue spreads, with my father's famous brisket complemented by my mother's homemade tamales and enough side dishes to feed twice as many people as were actually attending. Uncle David and Aunt Patricia arrived early, both of them greeting me with congratulations and genuine enthusiasm about my promotion. Even my cousin Marco was there, offering a sincere apology for his dismissive comments at the previous barbecue, and expressing genuine interest in learning more about my work with Henderson Global. "Emma, I owe you an apology," Marco said, pulling me aside while other family members were gathering around the dinner table. "I was out of line a couple weeks ago, and I've been thinking about what you said ever since. My wife looked up your company online, and she showed me some articles about the work you do. I had no idea how complicated and important it was. I'm sorry for being ignorant and disrespectful." His apology was simple and genuine, representing exactly the kind of family recognition I'd been hoping for without having to demand or defend. More importantly, it suggested that our previous confrontation had prompted some family members to educate themselves about my career rather than simply dismissing what they didn't understand. Sophia and Ricardo arrived just as we were sitting down to dinner, both of them offering congratulations that seemed genuinely enthusiastic rather than obligatory. Sophia, in particular, surprised me by asking detailed questions about my new responsibilities and expressing admiration for the challenges of managing such a large and complex client relationship. "Emma, I have to admit that I didn't really understand what you did before," Sophia said, as we settled into our seats around the expanded dining room table. "But Ricardo works with marketing consultants at the hospital, and he explained how difficult it is to develop strategies for large organizations. What you've accomplished sounds incredibly impressive, and I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like your work wasn't important." The acknowledgement was unexpected and deeply meaningful, representing recognition from the sibling whose achievements had always overshadowed mine in our family's hierarchy of success. More importantly, it suggested that our previous conflicts had prompted genuine reflection and learning, rather than just temporary politeness designed to avoid future confrontations. Dinner conversation flowed naturally between family news, professional updates, and shared memories that reminded everyone why these gatherings mattered, despite their occasional complications. For the first time in years, I felt completely comfortable discussing my work and career goals without worrying about dismissive comments or well-meaning but misguided advice about my life choices. "So, Emma," Uncle David said as we moved from dinner to dessert, "help me understand what it means to be a vice president at your age. I know it's impressive, but what kind of responsibilities does that involve, and where does it lead in terms of your career development?" The question was exactly the kind of thoughtful inquiry I'd been hoping for from family members, demonstrating genuine interest in my professional life rather than superficial politeness or skeptical concern. I found myself explaining not just my current role, but my long-term career aspirations and the opportunities that the Henderson Global success had created for future advancement. Being a VP means I'm responsible for developing and maintaining relationships with our largest clients, I explained, feeling comfortable with the technical details for the first time in family conversation. It also means I have budget authority for hiring additional staff, equity participation in the company's growth, and opportunities to shape our strategic direction as we expand into new markets and service areas. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from my salary increase to my plans for professional development to the possibility of eventually starting my own agency or consulting practice. Throughout the discussion, family members asked informed questions, offered relevant observations from their own professional experiences, and expressed genuine excitement about my future prospects. As the evening wound down and family members began making their departure preparations, my father pulled me aside for a private conversation that felt both overdue and perfectly timed. "Mija, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying the kind of earnest sincerity that made me understand where I'd inherited my own commitment to authentic communication. "Your mother and I spent years worrying about your career choices, instead of trusting your judgment and supporting your dreams. We were wrong, and we're sorry. You've built something remarkable, and we should have been celebrating your success instead of questioning your decisions." The apology was comprehensive and heartfelt, addressing not just recent misunderstandings but years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how my parents viewed my capabilities and judgment, acknowledging that my success was the result of smart choices and hard work, rather than lucky breaks or temporary trends. "Thank you, Dad." "That means more to me than you know," I replied, feeling emotions that I'd been suppressing for years finally finding safe expression. "I never needed you to understand every detail of my work, but I did need to feel like my achievements mattered and my choices were respected. Tonight feels like the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than patient tolerance." The evening ended with family members exchanging contact information for future gatherings, making tentative plans for holiday celebrations, and expressing genuine interest in staying updated about my career developments and personal life. As Jake and I drove home through the quiet Austin suburbs, I reflected on how dramatically my family relationships had evolved over the past month. The confrontation at the barbecue had been uncomfortable and emotionally draining, but it had also cleared the air in ways that allowed for genuine communication and mutual understanding. My subsequent professional success had provided concrete evidence that my career choices were sound and my achievements were worthy of respect. Most importantly, my family's willingness to educate themselves about my work and acknowledge their previous misconceptions had created space for the kind of supportive relationships I'd always hoped for. Sunday morning brought a text message that would add another layer of validation to an already remarkable week. The message was from Patricia Williams at Henderson Global, and it contained news that exceeded my most optimistic expectations about how our partnership might develop. "Emma, our board of directors was so impressed with your presentation and our initial strategy sessions that they've asked us to explore expanding our contract to include Henderson Global's European operations. This could potentially double the scope of our partnership. Are you available for a call Monday morning to discuss the possibilities?" The message represented an opportunity that could transform not just my own career trajectory, but Innovate First Solutions' position in the international marketing landscape. Managing Henderson Global's European operations would require developing expertise in multiple countries, currencies, and regulatory environments while coordinating with team members across different time zones and cultural contexts. More importantly, it would establish me as one of the youngest executives in Austin's business community to manage truly global client relationships, opening doors to opportunities and professional recognition that most marketing professionals never experienced, regardless of their age or experience level. As I shared the news with Jake over our Sunday morning coffee, I realized that the journey from family disappointment to professional vindication had been more rapid and comprehensive than I'd ever imagined possible. 6 weeks earlier, I'd been defending my career choices at a backyard barbecue. Now I was being offered the opportunity to expand an already record-breaking client relationship into international markets. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened with a momentum and clarity that suggested I'd finally found the right intersection of personal authenticity, professional competence, and family understanding. The Henderson Global. Opportunity was just the beginning of what felt like an entirely new chapter in both my career and my personal relationships. 3 months later, I stood in the same backyard where my family had once dismissed my career as meaningless computer work. But this time, the gathering had a completely different energy. My parents had organized a celebration dinner, and the entire extended family was there to honor something extraordinary that had happened at work that week. Victoria Chen, my CEO, had flown in from her business trip specifically for this occasion. She rarely attended employee family events, but what had transpired was too significant to handle through normal channels. As we gathered around the familiar picnic table where I'd once defended my professional choices, Victoria stood up with the kind of smile that suggested momentous news. "I need to share something remarkable about Emma's achievements," Victoria announced to my assembled relatives, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of Austin's most respected business leaders. Henderson Global was so impressed with her strategic work that they've expanded our contract to include their global operations across Europe and Asia. The total value is now $96 million over 5 years. The number hung in the USA, air like fireworks, and I watched my family's faces transform as they processed what Victoria was actually saying. My cousin Marco, who had once called my ambitions pretentious, looked genuinely stunned. Uncle David set down his beer and started calculating what those figures meant in terms of my professional standing and earning potential. "But that's not the most important news," Victoria continued, turning to face me directly. "Emma, Henderson Global's board of directors has specifically requested that you open your own consulting division under the Innovate First umbrella. They want you to become their exclusive strategic partner for all international marketing initiatives. Effective. Immediately, you're being promoted to Executive Vice President and Managing Director of Global Strategy." The promotion was beyond anything I'd imagined possible when I'd first started working in marketing. At 28, I would be running my own division within one of Austin's fastest-growing agencies, with complete autonomy over hiring, client, development, and strategic direction. More importantly, Henderson Global's confidence in my capabilities had created a pathway to entrepreneurial success that could define my entire career trajectory. My mother stood up slowly, her eyes filling, with tears as she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't just pride or happiness, but something deeper that acknowledged how completely she'd misunderstood my potential and how wrong she'd been about my career choices. "Emma, mija, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," Linda said, her voice breaking slightly as she addressed not just me but the entire family gathering. "We called you useless for chasing dreams we couldn't understand. We questioned every choice you made because it didn't fit our narrow definition of success. But you've accomplished something extraordinary, something that proves you were right all along about your own potential and vision." The acknowledgement was everything I'd hoped for throughout my entire career, but it was also more meaningful because it came after genuine understanding rather than superficial politeness. My family had taken the time to research my industry, to understand what my achievements actually meant, and to recognize that their skepticism had been based on ignorance rather than legitimate concern. Victoria raised her glass in a toast that brought everyone to their feet. "To Emma Rodriguez, who never doubted her own worth even when others couldn't see it, and who built something remarkable through talent, determination, and the courage to demand the respect she deserved." As my family echoed the toast and surrounded me with congratulations that felt completely authentic for the first time in my adult life, I realized that the transformation had been as much about them as about me. They'd learned to expand their definition of success, to trust my judgment about my own life, and to celebrate achievements that existed outside their previous experience and understanding. The evening concluded with my father pulling me aside for a private conversation that felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had taken years to complete. Robert Rodriguez was a man who measured worth through concrete accomplishments, and his recognition of my success carried weight that extended far beyond family approval. "Emma, I've been thinking about that night when you told us we didn't understand what you did for work," he said, his voice carrying the kind of earnest sincerity that had always characterized our most important conversations. "You were absolutely right, and we were absolutely wrong. But more than that, you taught us something important about believing in people we love even when their dreams don't match our expectations." His words represented the kind of family relationship I'd always hoped for, built on mutual respect rather than patient tolerance of differences. The journey from dismissal to recognition had been longer and more complicated than I'd wanted, but it had also created space for authentic connections that wouldn't have been possible without the confrontation and growth that had preceded this moment of understanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.